Hello to everybody who's joined our webinar today. My name is Colin Dennis. I'm Chairman of the Safety and Reliability Society webinar committee, and I'd very much like to welcome you to our webinar today. The topic of our webinar is lessons learned from 10 years of using the common safety method for risk evaluation and assessment, commonly known as the CSMRA. This particular topic is of great interest to me. In my time working at the Rail Safety and Standards Board in the UK, I participated in several of the European Rail Agency working groups on the development of the CSMs, and including the CSMRA. During this time, I found it a very interesting task, in particularly trying to get the 27 member states who were sitting around the table to agree on a methodology going forward, and with many lively discussions that were had. I also had the opportunity to undertake a couple of the initial independent safety assessments as part of the assessment body role for the CSMRA, and it's therefore of great interest to me to know how things have been going over the last 10 years of the actual practical application of the CSMRA, and that is the topic of our talk this afternoon. So in terms of the program, I'm doing my little bit of introduction. Then we're going to have 4 presentations. Dragan Jovocic is going to give us a bit of background into the objectives of the CSMRA. He's not going to be talking about the methodology in detail. That was provided in some background information prior to the event. We're then going to move on to the experience of both the infrastructure manager, National Safety Authority, and European Rail Agency. So for the infrastructure manager role, Ivan Lucic of Network Rail is going to be talking to us. Then from the National Safety Authority perspective, we have Pete Gracie from the Office of Rail and Road. And then from the European Rail Agency, Dragan Jovocic will come back on again to tell us about their experiences and what we can look forward to going forwards. We will then have a question and answer session where all 3 presenters will be available to answer questions, and hopefully you'll be able to pose the questions that come up during the presentations. Towards the end of the session, I'll talk to you about how to access the webinar and the recordings. We normally have access to the webinar as a Safety and Reliability Society members only activity, but I think with the number of people who have subscribed to our webinar today, that some may be disappointed that they won't be able to get on to the webinar. So we will make the slides and the recording available to everybody who's registered shortly after the event later on today. Finally, there will be a feedback session with the electronic feedback form right at the end, and please note that the webinar is being recorded. So just to improve your webinar experience a bit, I'd just like to point out a couple of key controls with the Click Meeting software. First of all, if you want to move the audio-visual pod away from the presentation area, you should just click the dock undock button in the bottom right-hand corner of the AV pod. To move the chat over to the right-hand side, if you just hover over this grey rectangle on the presentation area and click on the right or left-hand arrow keys, you can alter the size of the chat area. Most importantly is the way in which you ask questions. And if you want to ask a question, please click on the Ask Question icon first, type your question, and that will come up as a question to ask the presenters at the end of the presentation sessions. For anything else, please click the right message icon. So I'd like that's the brief introduction to that. I would now like us to move on to the first of the presentations, the introductory presentation to be given by Dragan Jovocic. And if I could ask Dragan to switch on his microphone, and then I'll do some introduction. So Dragan Jovocic is the Safety and Operations Unit Project Officer at the European Rail Agency. Dragan has more than 25 years of experience in the railway sector, Before joining the European Rail Agency in 2006, he worked in the rail industry in the command control branch of Alstom for 13 years. He was Project Safety Assurance Manager in charge of RAMS activities and the production of safety cases in line with the requirements of Senelec 50126, 50128 and 50129 standards. At the European Rail Agency, Dragan has taken part in the writing of the CSMRA and the revised regulation 352/2009. Dragan, I'd like to hand over to you to give your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Hello to everyone. To move the slides, yes. I will just give a little bit of history and context for those who are not from the European market, initial objectives, and just a reminder of the method. So why was CSM for risk assessment necessary? As you all probably know, in many industrial domains, not only in the railways, a gradual improvement of the safety resulted from costly experiences and bad lessons learned from the past, tragic accidents. So prevention of similar occurrences was regulated reactively with the definition of new national rules, laws, standards, and practices. So consequently, every country developed its own way of doing, which unavoidably led to what you all know, differences in the principles and approaches, both in terms of technical systems, but also in terms of safety cultures, which made the breaking through international market very difficult. So it was especially dependent on multilateral agreements, and it was conditioned to additional and very often unnecessary checks, safety demonstrations, and additional authorization. So in order to open the European market, you understand that it became obvious for harmonization in Europe. So without entering into the details, the harmonization across European railways fits with the European overall new concepts and new methodology. It is based on two pillars: technical harmonization through technical specifications for interoperability, and safety harmonization through common approaches to safety management. So in Europe, it is regulated through directives, and the main objectives is to have, I come back to the previous slide, to use independent conformity assessment bodies who will verify the compliance with the applicable legislation. These conformity assessment bodies are independent second pair of eyes who are going to give a statement at the end on the compliance with technical and safety requirements. So as you know, the railway activities generate risks. So in order to ensure a safe operation and maintenance, the European legislation requires the railway undertakings, infrastructure managers, and entities in charge of maintenance to put in place a safety management system for identifying and controlling the risks related to their activities. So compared to the historical practices in railways, where well-established national rules, standards, and legislation had to be followed, this new European regulatory framework, which is based on the concept of risk and proactive risk management, gives full responsibility to the operators for the safe operation, traffic management, and maintenance. So this is really new for the stakeholders, and they have to put in place a safety management system to be acknowledged by entitled authorities to attest their capability to manage safely their business. So where does the CSM for risk assessment fit in this big picture? In fact, with another method on monitoring, the CSM for risk assessment and monitoring, there are two pillars within this proactive safety management system, Plan, Do, Check, Act, where the CSM for risk assessment analyzes proactively what can go wrong with an intended modification of to be made to the railway system. And then the CSM for monitoring is the second pillar, which will verify the effectiveness of the predictive risk control measures defined by the proactive risk assessment. So if you want to compare to something which is used in other disciplines, the relation between these two CSMs in automatic regulation system is the following. The risk assessment is intended to keep the system under control. So what we want to achieve to keep the risks under control. And then the CSM for monitoring is the measurement instrument which helps supporting the stability of the system based on the effectiveness of the predictive measures and the actual behavior of the system. So in summary, compared to the historical practices, react and fix approach, based on lessons from the past and accidents, practices, the proactive approach to risk management consists to, when making a change, analyze systematically what can go wrong, can it reasonably happen, what are the impacts, and what can I do to prevent it? Or if I can't prevent, what can I do to manage the negative impacts of it? So I hope you still hear me. So when we developed the method, the main considerations was to make it with the stakeholders. We wanted to have a generic and harmonized and systematic approach to risk identification and safety assessment based on existing practices in the railways. We recognized that the culture of the railways was good, so freedom was left to companies continue using their instruments and tools, but we wanted to harmonize the principle, the process for the risk assessment, to allow legally the use of code of practice and similar reference system, because we know that at that time, the former Senelec versions only focused on explicit estimation, and to request transparency for documenting the outcomes of the risk assessment. So the CSM can be fulfilled in many different ways, not a unique way, and we do not include in the CSM how to fulfill the requirements of the CSM. Other considerations, because of the opening of the railway market and the new commerce, new players, importance to emphasize on the roles and responsibilities of everyone, need for cooperation for a joint identification and management of risks across interfaces between actors and subsystems, and where necessary to have a formal way to exchange safety relevant information. So equal treatment also and transparent decision making for all actors who comply with the CSM in order to achieve mutual recognition based on this independent second pair of eyes, and to leave flexibility to the user to decide when something is important and when systematic and formal approach is necessary, or when it's simpler, less formalism, which do not need a second pair of eyes for witnessing the application. Just 2 slides, so I come to the end concerning this introductory part. You have seen this flow chart. This is the process where we have the risk assessment process. Standard 1, system definition, identification of potential hazards, analysis of those hazards and control of the associated risks with 3 possible pillars without priority between them, evaluation and acceptance of the risks, then deriving the requirements, safety requirements which have to be implemented, and then demonstration of achievement, with the necessity to use a formal tool for registration recording the hazards, and for significant changes, the necessity to have an independent pair of eyes witnessing. So how should it be done? I said no constraint for that, possibility to use standards. Who shall apply the method? Relevant undertakings, infrastructure managers, and entities in charge of maintenance, manufacturers when they apply, when they put on the market interoperability constituents and subsystems, and if this is requested by contracts. The method has to be applied always, at least for deciding whether the change is significant. And the process in Annex 1 of the method is obligatory in that case. The one who decides, it's not the national authority, but the proposer, unless there are national rules which define that. And important to emphasize is that the method requests that non-significant changes which are safety related, they also have to be properly addressed. So, as you know, when the change is significant, the method requires to have an independent evaluator. The purpose of this independent evaluator is to provide the necessary reasonable confidence to authorizing entities who must provide a decision and authorization based on results from the risk assessment. And this body will verify the correct application of the process in the CSM, but also the appropriateness of the results from the risk assessment in order to give an expert judgment on the confidence that the change is properly managed and that it can fulfill safely the initial expected objectives, and therefore to enable to gain trust in an effective risk management by the proposer to reach the mutual recognition on the results from the risk assessment. So these are the historical context, the considerations we want to reach, not constrained, but just harmonize the process, additional information to be looked for in guidance material and standards, and just a reminder of the concept. Just a parenthesis, the assessment body can be also an in-house assessment body compared to notified bodies who must always be independent, but it's another question. Thank you for this first part, Colin.
We'll hear from Jogan a bit later on about the ERA's experience with the CSMRA. So now I'd like to move on to our second presenter, and I'm going to ask Ivan to turn on his microphone, and I will introduce Ivan before we get on to the next session. So Ivan is the Eastern Region Systems Engineer and Chair of the Safety Review Panel for Infrastructure Projects at Network Rail. Ivan is an experienced railway systems assurance and systems integration management professional working on delivery-focused system integration and assurance solutions for some of the most complex railway projects in the UK. His railways career includes numerous senior roles within the railway industry. Most recently in 2018, when he became Engineering Systems Director in Network Rail Infrastructure Projects, and later became the Chair of the Eastern Region Safety Review Panel. Ivan, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you, Colin. Just very briefly, it's a system review panel, not just safety review panel. And the reason I insist on that is because I actually think safety is an integral part of a bigger picture. We always need to be cognizant of other things as we work on it. So this is about applying the CSMRA in real life on railway projects. And the first thing is disclaimer, these are my own personal view, not necessarily the official views of Network Rail. I do believe and know for a fact that most of my colleagues agree with me, but Network Rail, as you can appreciate, is quite a big company, and actually getting an approval for an official Network Rail view was too challenging to actually go through for this presentation. So talking about the scale of what's happening in Network Rail, the data we looked at covers the period before CSM was introduced from 2006 to 2020. But we looked at all of these projects and how we managed them, and basically concluded that some of them we actually did apply a very similar methodology to CSM. So the numbers are Network Rail wide. It probably doesn't include every single project, so quite a lot of heavy maintenance projects are not necessarily managed in the same way, so we couldn't get the data on it. And there were a few projects in the data set where the status wasn't really clear, so we discounted these from the overall below numbers. So the total number of projects we looked at for this purpose was more than 3,152. In total, there is about 18% of projects that were classified as significant, and the rest of it as non-significant projects. So this is a scale of the task in Network Rail. Before joining Network Rail, I spent over 10 years in London Underground. I was head of system safety on the capital delivery projects. And London Underground, as a light rail or the metro, doesn't have to follow CSM. So in London Underground, we didn't do that. And I decided to compare, the pain and gain of both slightly different approaches. And for that, I've looked at three projects that are very similar in the scope and the challenges around it. So the two were simple depot upgrades. I said one in Network Rail, one in London Underground. Conventional signaling upgrade, again, one in Network Rail, one in London Underground, and an upgrade of the station on both sides. And without going into too much detail, because we simply don't have the time for that, but I'm quite happy to discuss it in some other forum, or you can contact me through Colin, or I will put my email in the chat later on, so we can exchange experiences there as well. The whole experience was cheaper and easier and more efficient in London Underground. Now, in the next few slides, I'll try to go in a few details why I believe so. So in terms of legislation, or CSMRA legislation specifically, that comes through the question, what does London LU means London Underground? So there is nothing wrong with the concept in legislation at all. I just think that there is a room for some improvement there. So roles defined in legislation do not necessarily easily fit the network rail organization and the life cycle and how the accountabilities change from beginning or an emerging of the project to the end to handing it back into service. So I guess we should make it a little bit easier for people to actually apply it, and I would probably guess that it's not different with any other infrastructure manager. The question I have in particular about the criteria with CSMRA is, what do we really mean by additionality in practice? Who can manage additionality in organization? Whenever we come to that question, it's actually quite a challenging question to answer, because it's almost impossible to answer that question from within a project. You really need to look at the bigger picture across the whole line, across the whole route that the project is part of. And then in that case, who is actually best suited to do that, and how is that done? I have came across numerous times across discussions about if you're a signaling project and we produce a 5126 compliant safety case, is this still compliant with the safety justification as in CSMRA, or we need to produce both, or we just do safety justification, etc. So again, I think there is some room to clarify that in legislation and make it crystal clear what we actually mean and what is the difference between the two, and then each of these is applicable and valid. In legislation, the competencies for actors and those who deliver change to the railway are not really defined, but they are defined for us both. Again, in my view, the focus on competencies defined for us both is perhaps wrong. It's focused on legislation and understanding legislation, as opposed to actually understanding how is the real life project going on and a real life application of system safety. And again, as opposed to site safety or CDM, as we call it in UK. And also the focus of legislation is on what, which is probably right for legislation, but there is no guidance on how to do things. And again, I think it is quite needed. From my short experience in network rail this last 3 years, there is a huge variance in how projects approach this, and it surely is not right way of doing it. In terms of implementation, network rail, no, it's actually wrong. It's not network rail, it's implementation in UK, really. The focus again is on what needs to be done with no guidance on how to do it. The ASBOs often do tick box audits, not assessments, and very often these are overly bureaucratic without actually looking at and trying to understand the real issues and focus on a pragmatic solution that really doesn't help anyone. Most importantly, it's actually not mandated by legislation to have an external ASBO. So why we cannot do that internally? It works perfectly well in London Underground. We do have some great ASBOs and some great people working for ASBOs. I don't have any particular problem with that, but as a concept, I would suggest that people who are actually involved with work probably know much more about the project than somebody coming completely external that is not really necessarily involved in the practical application of technology or everything else we are doing to the railway. System safety and CDM or site safety don't really mix well and should not be mixed. And I've seen a question about that for later on. But if I cannot come back to this slide, whoever asked the question, can you please try to memorize this little Venn diagram on the right? Far too often I've seen hazard records where everything is dumped in one place and it becomes an unmanageable beast that is really difficult to then close and get through any review and manage through a successful closure. What about the projects that are not significant but shall be authorized? Again, there are projects that require interoperability authorization, but they're not significant. Do we really have to have ASBOL for these as well, and safety justification reports and all of that bureaucratic stuff that comes with that and increases the cost without necessarily adding value to the final outcome of it? Now, I would pose the question, and for those who are outside of UK, I'll explain what the Yellow Book is. Some 15 years ago, maybe more, British Rail, Railtrack at the time, came up and concluded that there is a need to have an industry-wide guidance on good practice for engineering safety management or system safety management. And the whole industry got together and came up with something that was known as the Yellow Book. Quite a few people were trained on that. Quite a few people actually started applying it. And then when the CSM came, the Railway Standards and Safety Board declared that the Yellow Book is not compatible with new legislation and stopped maintaining it. It can still be downloaded from internet, but it's not necessarily maintained by RSSB or anybody. It was plain English, so everybody could understand it. It was not written for people that are experts in this area, and I think it's right because we simply do not have enough experts to rely only on them. All of the engineers should be capable of doing proper system safety. It provided simple and very clear guidance on what, how, when, where, who, and why needs to be done, with some examples as well of what good looks like. It was also supported by quite extensive training and certification as well. So when I joined Railtrack some 4 years ago, all of us actually had to go to a 2 days long Yellow Book training course and get a certificate to be able to do our work later on. And the scope did include maintenance as well as projects, as well as big changes to it. So in my mind, there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. And the reason I bring it up will be clear on the next slide. So in terms of conclusions and recommendations for ERA, I would suggest think about simplifying roles defined in the legislation. So it's easier to fit in the generic railway IM organization, because as I said, it is actually quite difficult to do that sometimes. Consult those who deliver what are points that need further clarification, and then provide that clarification or point to where the clarification is. You know, CSMRA versus Senilec, additionality, some support on how to do it, etc. For us in UK, simplify and take bureaucracy out of it, please. Again, everybody who knows me, I hope will agree that I am very safety conscious and I don't give up on safety at all. But bureaucracy actually doesn't support it. It's got completely the opposite effect. And please take the bureaucracy out of it. In my mind, as I said, there's nothing wrong with the Yellow Book. There is nothing there that contradicts CSMRA. So either bring it back as industry good practice guidance, or let us organize and get together to come up with something new, or a new version of Yellow Book, whatever we want to call it, so that we can all have a consistent approach on how we do that, and save money and effort long term and achieve safer solution, in my mind. For everybody, please make it plain English. One of the most beautiful things about the Yellow Book was that it had this crystal mark of plain English. I'm still spending lots of my time explaining what should be very simple things to very intelligent chartered engineers. So fault surely is not on them. Fault is on our side. We need to make it understandable to everybody. And again, please consult those who actually do it on the ground, because as I said, I've just seen quite often too much bureaucracy involved in the whole process. In Network Rail, we did quite a lot of work to bring the consistency across all of our projects, and we're still working on it. We had developed quite a lot of processes and training and guidance and templates and instructions, and it can all be found on the System Integration Hub. I see from the list of participants that Kevin is on the list. So Kevin, could you please paste in the chat a link to the external hub so people can use it? I'm more than happy for anyone to use the hub. The only thing I would ask from you guys is please give us a feedback on what you've seen so far on the hub, and if you applied, on how did it go. There is also in my mind really good training on basic application of CSM on the hub as well. Again, free for everyone to use. So this is the end of my presentation, Colin. I think I've gone through it pretty fast, but yeah.
Appreciate your thoughts from the infrastructure manager's perspective and your own personal views on the implementation of the CSMRA. I would now like to introduce our third speaker for today, which is Pete Gracie. Pete is Head of Interoperability and Rail Vehicle Engineering at the Office of Rail and Road. A former Royal Navy submarine weapons engineer officer, Pete has over 17 years experience in railway safety, signalling, engineering and interoperability. His railway career has included project delivery for Network Rail, Bechtel and Crossrail. He was the systems engineering manager for the Docklands Light Railway during the extensive preparations for the London 2012 Olympics, and senior assessment body and notified body signatory for the network certification body. He took up his current role at the Office of Rail and Road in early 2020. Pete, if I can hand over to you to give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. This is going to be a little bit of a personal journey for me, and a reflection on how CSMRA has come across during my the sort of second half of my railway career to date. So prior to CSMRA coming into force in 2012, I was, as has been mentioned, I was working on the Docklands Light Railway. In that particular capacity, I was a designated competent person reviewing safety application of some of our projects, and also securing independent competent persons to do safety verification of our larger project. I moved to the network certification body in 2012, in fact, just before the London Olympics. And I then became a signatory for newly formed ASBO, NOVO. In fact, I joined the month before CSMRA came into force. What we were doing at that time within the organisation from a safety perspective was we had been given the role of continuing Network Rail's internal application of the pre-CSMRA scheme, which was safety verification by independent competent person, which was specified in the Railways and Other Guided Transport Systems Regulations 2006. Which was subsequently amended to reflect the introduction of CSMRA. So I worked actually as an independent competent person. There were a few issues around that, and I'll talk about those in a minute. After leaving the network certification body, I actually went back into project delivery again, and I ended up in a position where I was acting on behalf of the client and procuring assessment body, notified body, and designated body services, acting on behalf of the proposer of change, presenting applications to my current body, the Office of Rail and Road, for authorisation to place into service. And after that, I then moved into my current role. As Colin said, I joined this particular role early in 2020, 11 working days before we started working from home, 9 working days before the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. So Ivan's talked a little bit about the application of CSMRA in the United Kingdom, and I wanted to reflect a bit on some of that and the transition that happened between the previous regime to CSMRA. I'll agree with Ivan. I think the Yellow Book was really useful. It covered extensive guidance. One of the problems, I think, was that it wasn't always followed. My own experience of infrastructure projects within Network Rail, particularly, whilst there was extensive guidance in the Yellow Book, the actual application of those particular methods and practices was scarce. So my view is actually that CSMRA is a subset of what the Yellow Book actually wanted us to do, but being legislation, it puts more emphasis on making sure it happens. I think it's compatible with what the Yellow Book had within it. I wouldn't say no to something like the Yellow Book coming back. I think it would be useful to provide other techniques. What does CSMRA actually give us? Well, it gives us a minimum acceptable application of safety management as regards system change. You can always do more. And what did Yellow Book provide us with? Well, it provided us with tools, techniques, and advice that could allow us to do more. One of the issues I think I saw over my time was the transition, particularly within Network Rail projects, from safety verification by independent competent person to CSMRA, and the way in which new requirements of CSMRA were communicated across the Network Rail project. Certainly under safety verification, there had been a bit over application. If you take a requirement that says and make it or, you increase the number of things that come under that requirement for independent review. Not to say that that's a bad thing. It probably benefited the project delivery community to have that extra level of overview and independent assessment. However, there was a great bias within the independent competent person regime around the knowledge and experiences of the individuals who created the system that Network Rail applied, and the individuals who applied that system. And you tended to get a lot of very much the output of safety verification would be the flavour of the individual background of the individual who did the assessment. I think the CSMRA process, using an assessment body rather than one person, actually puts us in a better position, provided it's applied correctly. I'm concerned about the comment Ivan made about tick box audit. It's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be about assessing the application of a process, making sure that an appropriate process is followed appropriately, not looking at the detail of design per se. Transition to CSMRA, there was I think I saw during this particular period a reluctance to transition across, and there are a number of projects that I suppose wanted to keep grandfather rights and continue to completion under safety verification, not transition to CSMRA. Now, if you're at the tail end of a project that's been running for a number of years and you haven't been following CSMRA because it's recently been introduced, then maybe it's sensible to say, well, we'll finish it off under the regime we were under. But if you're in a long ongoing project, there comes a point when you say, this is silly, we need to find a way of transitioning from one system to the other. Whilst I was working on the on-network works for the Crossrail program, so the bits of Crossrail that are outside of the central tunnel sections, the modification of the national network to accept the Crossrail trains coming out of the central London tunnels. When I was working on that, we were in a position where we'd been working under this regime, we needed to transition, and we found a way to do it. The problem is you're not starting from the right point because you didn't apply CSMRA from the beginning. You haven't had the benefits of earlier application of safety methods. And I certainly think that was an issue in the previous application. Whilst the yellow book again had plenty of stuff in it, the application of safety, system safety discipline tended to be late in the project's life. So there were missed opportunities. So you get to a position where you're not in the right starting point. You need to adhere to the spirit and head in the right direction. So a few further reflections. As an assessment body, or working for an assessment body, what's the big thing that came across to me? Education, 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 to somebody else's phrase. People didn't understand it, and they tended to shy away from CSMRA because they didn't understand it. That's not a problem. The problem is you need to educate, you need to explain. Both as an assessment body and as a client on project delivery, I spent a lot of time explaining this is actually quite simple. It's not asking you to do anything you shouldn't already have been doing. However, it's now legal. You are required to do it. I did find that there were issues both within when working as an assessment body or when working as on the client side in project delivery. There were issues of bias. As an assessment body, you sometimes find you're fighting against bias, or maybe it's the blinkered views of your client. Think a bit bigger picture. And as the client, sometimes I hit the problem of the bias of the assessor. I found myself in a position where I had to challenge a negative assessment of work that had been done. And I felt that the particular assessor was actually stepping outside of their responsibility, essentially trying to re-engineer my program. That's not your job. You're not supposed to be assessing what the solution is. You're supposed to be assessing that we have correctly applied safety management principles to that process and have produced a solution. Yeah, that was a problem. I hit a few technical issues trying to solve it. So working for an NSA, what's my views from where I am now? Well, again, I think education is an issue. If you don't explain things to people, you're not going to understand. They're not going to understand. You need to have a level of competence throughout the organisation to ensure that people know what it is they're doing and are applying things appropriately. It seems simple and straightforward, but the evidence shows that it's true. And communication absolutely necessary. The assessment bodies, in fact all of the conformance assessment bodies, the delivery organisation proposer changed, all need to talk to each other and need to come and talk to the NSA. I just seen a comment in the chat. Yes, I know it allows you to disagree with the assessor. However, I'd rather persuade the assessor that I'm right. So, just move. I've lost my mouse. Right, thank you. Okay, there we go. So, CSMRA, my view, I think it's really good. It is, however, you have to remember a minimum level of safety application. I think you can do better if you really try. It's great that we've moved from react and fix to predict and prevent. I would contest that actually we moved to predict and prevent prior to the introduction of CSMRA in the UK. However, as I said before, the application was patchy. The CSMRA process supports authorization, and although I take Ivan's point about there are some projects where significance would tend to indicate you don't need to do independent assessment, but you might also find that if you're doing something that requires authorization under interoperability, you do need sometimes the assessment body input in terms of backing up your specific case decisions, providing support for your claim of safe integration. One of the great things I see is the blind application of codes of practice. I think it's great that we have a methodology that allows us to use codes of practice, standards and the like, and to compare to reference system, but you've got to understand what it is you are trying to apply and why you are applying it. Just because you've applied a code of practice does not mean you have removed the risk. It means you've probably reduced it if you've understood it and applied it properly. You may not have reduced the risk completely. You may need to look deeper. What's your residual risk? Is there still something you can do? What is still reasonable? Management of the assessment. One thing that I've seen on projects, both before I arrived at ORR and since, is sometimes you hit a problem where the correct decisions have been made. One might contest the correct decisions have been made, but maybe you can't see the early documentation of those decisions within the project documentation. So at what point was the issue raised and resolved? Surely it needs to be documented as you go along. But utilize the competence of your own team. Great competence within our project delivery organizations. Make sure you're using it, but also if you're delivering something, I have to remember that my responsibility is going to be on infrastructure into rail vehicle rolling stock. If you're delivering something for somebody else, make sure you involve the end user in the process of assessing the risks, the safety, and the acceptability of the design. Sometimes that can be difficult, particularly if you're designing rolling stock and you do not know who your operator is. You don't want to end up in a situation where you've done a really good assessment of your new rolling stock. You've forgotten about what might happen whilst it's parked in the state. Climbing and surfing risk, I'm thinking of there. And as you go through your assessment, you should, I mean, we've already said it, you should challenge the assessment body. Are they doing their job properly? Are they within their limit? And if you're having an issue, make sure you resolve it. My boss isn't going to like it if you come to me with unresolved issues and are trying to get something approved to place into service under interoperability. Well, we'd like to see a nice safety assessment report that concludes that you have dealt with all the issues. I know you won't have dealt with everything completely, We should have a plan for those that are still closed out, how they're going to be doing. I do like the fact that better application of CSMRA is starting to involve safety and safety arguments earlier in investment decision processes. I don't think it's all the way there yet. It's a bit like through life costing. I'm not sure that that's quite built into our national infrastructure decisions, but at least we're moving in the right direction. And I think that'll do. Thank you.
Do you hear me? So I understand through the chat that the sound is there. Okay, thank you. So the second part I have to present is related to the return of experience, REX, of the agency with the CSM for risk assessment, experience, lessons learned, and next steps. So the regulation requires the agency to make a survey. So this is what the agency has done, looking through the eyes of the national safety authorities, entities in charge of maintenance and assessment bodies. In 2018, we did a survey, and there was a reply rate of 33%, and the report is available on the agency webpage if you want to hear more. So what I'm presenting to you, it's an average picture across the EU. It does not represent, of course, the picture of every individual company or country. So don't have allergic reactions to some of the information I will present. So the method is in force since 2009. So we could expect that in 10 years to have some experience, valuable experience with the method. But in practice, the railway sector is reluctant to use the risk assessment and independent assessment by an assessment body. So I just check. Okay, it was not a message for me. I'm still heard. So the sector is reluctant to both the CSM and using an independent assessor because they have fears and a wrong perception of the concepts of risk. Therefore, despite so many years and mandatory use, in practice, the experience is still very poor. And it is not, as you will see, used so often by the sector. So why is the sector reluctant to use the CSM? Remember the introductory part that I made with the change compared to the historical way of doing, following blindly rules, national rules, standards, and so on, where now the risk-based approach requires to systematically and proactively consider what can go wrong and what can I do to have it under control. So, in fact, the Achilles heel of the CSM is this concept of significant change filter. For the reasons previously explained, the method, so big change, important, need a witness, we leave flexibility to the proposer to decide when to apply the formal process and when something lighter can be done. So the side effect of this flexibility left in the method for right reasons, that possibility is misused, abusively used by some stakeholders to bypass the use of the harmonized process and to appoint the external assessment body. So the return of experience indicates that many people perceive risk and risk assessment as complicated, boring, a boring job, which requires automatically production of a lot of unnecessary paper. Nobody likes it and nobody is happy to deal with it. So the concept of significant is intentionally misused, as I said, for the two reasons: no formalism, and I will not have anyone who will dig into my organizational issues. So this behavior is not understandable, knowing that, and that's why I found important to emphasize this concept of safety management plan, do, check, act, overarching regulation, which requires rail undertakings, infrastructure managers, and entities in charge of maintenance to control all risks arising from a change, regardless whether the change is significant or not. So, the thinking in terms of risks, as I said, is a big change. But at the same time, the sector is too much self-confident that the railways are safe because we are running trains for more than 150 years using well-known rules. We know our business, and we do not need to be taught what we have to do and how to do it. So it is important to emphasize that there is an underestimation that in 150 years, the railway history, the risks have also evolved, and there are new risks related to the complexity of the architecture and technology used by the railway system. The operating speeds and traffic density also increased. The interactions with the humans in all the development processes of the system, design, installation, operation, maintenance, are bigger and more complex. And there is a much higher turnover of the staff within the railway companies, where they spend less time to have a mindset and build a railway safety culture. So the overall picture that we can retrieve from the survey that we have done is that only 2 to 3%, less than 5% of changes are significant. And I think that Ivan underlined in a few years how many changes Network Rail had. So big companies have between 500 and 1,000 changes per year. A common picture for a country or a company cannot be drawn from the survey. And the levels of understanding and of the application and experience are dependent on the country, on the company in the country, or even on the team making risk assessment in one company. So nevertheless, the general indicators which emerge from the analysis of the returned replies, a small minority of stakeholders well understands and correctly applies the CSM, but this ratio is only between 10 to 15% of RUs, IMs, ECMs who have a positive experience. And it is to note that manufacturers who are used to apply the Senelec, this ratio is probably higher, but we don't have a measure of that. Then we have two other categories. A large number of stakeholders still do not understand and face difficulties in applying, but they are learning while doing and improving, continually improving. Another category, the last one, a large number of stakeholders across whole EU still faces big difficulties with the understanding and correct application. And all the replies underline that we did not, despite 10 years of existence, for the reasons we mentioned, enough experience to be able to understand, correctly apply, and learn by doing. So what do we see between big and small companies? There is a variability. The size is not only the only constraining parameter. Big companies have big and complex organizational structures, higher needs and ambitions in terms of changes. So they face different problems and challenges than the smaller companies. Usually they have sufficient resources to allocate, usually a different department, and they have a higher knowledge of concepts related to risk. So they can apply a systematic top-down approach. Nevertheless, some big companies are still at the very beginning of the CSM. The small companies need more time to react and adapt to legislation. Usually smaller needs for change, so less opportunities to learn by implementing and doing. More problems with the staff and resources, so usually subcontracted because same staff doing many activities in the company. However, small companies are more flexible and able to implement smarter solutions that better fit and capture the essence of the CSM. And in case of deficiencies, they tend to solve the problems instead of debating about them. Also variability compared to newcomer and incumbent railways, historical companies. The newcomers often very flat organizations, less resources, subcontract, are capable to adapt faster to new terminology, and are flexible and can change easier their way of thinking and their mindset. So they tend to be proactive in applying and staying in the spirit of the CSM. The former historical companies, I'm afraid that Pete was right, more resistant to change and application of new methods, in particular if they feel it requires more resources. So they prefer to continue using the former processes and solutions. They are more rigid to new ways of thinking and solving the issues. So they consider the CSM as an unnecessary duplication of CNLEC, whereas the CSM and CNLEC is an extension of the CSM, and I said more resources that they can allocate. So as some additional details concerning the different parts of the CSM, there is a great lack of experts on the market, competent both in railways and in risk assessment. So we need something to be taken in Europe. Usually the evidence and documentation of risk assessment is of poor quality. It is better understood and more applied for technical changes, less experience for organizational and operational modifications, where the sector tends to use codes of practice. The CSM, I think we heard, is found to be complex and not understandable, so hardly applicable. These are just the thoughts of the sector without interpretation. They are perceived, the CSM is perceived as heavy, costly legal burden, applied often very late at the end of the project, where the design is already frozen and it's too late to take any corrective actions. Usually not used as a proactive tool, therefore for risk identification and prevention of risks. Almost never used for cost optimization and process improvement. And the CSM and the ASVOs are seen useless, burden, costly bureaucratic formalism without benefits, which is of course a wrong belief, as Pete explained. And the obligation of appointing the assessment body is maybe one of the factors that discourages a lot the decision on the significance. Something which was pointed out is also the role of the NSA and of the assessment body concerning organizational changes. System definition is usually poorly described, concerning especially boundaries, interfaces, and environmental conditions, which can have impacts on assumptions and limits of the risk assessment. So it leads to an incomplete identification of the hazards that cannot be controlled if they are not identified. Poor or not existent description of the organization of the project. So it's unclear who does what and the competence of people who are in charge of risk assessment. Poor interface management, while all the concerned actors are not systematically involved in the hazard identification and joint management of risks through the interfaces. And also what we see is many proposals tend to transfer the control of risks that go beyond the scope of responsibility of another actor. Omission to inform another actor who is capable to take an action if the risk is under its area of control. And due to the poor system definition and poor consideration of the interfaces, there is no assurance that all risks, and in particular those shared across the interfaces, are identified and well managed and controlled, and no assurance of the safe integration of the components in a subsystem, or even of the subsystem we are modifying within the overall railway system, knowing also that the concept of safe integration is also not well understood as well. Concerning the significant change, we have said many proposals estimate complex and difficult the assessment of the significance with the criteria of Article 4, and this is likely because of their intention to demonstrate that the change is non-significant, and unfortunately for safety-related changes, this is not an easy and possible task without a proper risk assessment. So the decision is also strongly dependent on the experience and knowledge of the persons responsible for the risk assessment. And as we have explained, in order to avoid the formalism of the CSM and the appointment of the ASBO, we have just a small percentage of changes which are significant, and they are usually technical. And this is an indicator that it is not, also, there is an indicator it is not related to risk-based or rule-based countries. The same experience is in all countries. Many proposers wrongly interpret non-significant as a permission to do nothing. And the justifications that the safety-related change is non-significant are poor when they exist. And when they exist, they are not, they do not give always confidence of a proper identification of the hazards and risks arising from non-significant changes. And many NSAs do not know how non-significant changes are assessed and how the associated risks are controlled. So concerning the use of the codes of practice, I think that Pete summarized well the problem. The sector prefers using codes of practice and comparison to similar reference systems, but often they forget to verify the relevance of the selected principle for the specific risks they are trying to manage. So they are used only to limit the risk management efforts. So the side effect is that it usually leads to the obligation to operate the system with constraining operation and maintenance measures, whereas explicit risk estimation could have enabled to identify measures, technical measures in the design, if risk assessment and assessment bodies are involved early in the design to prevent those risks and heavy operational constraints. So although they are preferably used, these two principles, codes of practice and similar reference systems, they are not always well applied. And just one example, using codes of practice do not require the same level of detail of the hazard identification. So the stakeholders are trying to match very detailed hazards from the hazard identification with overall concepts of a code of practice. So then it leads to trying to stick to the code of practice without really understanding what the risk analyst is doing. So what can be concluded from the survey that the agency has done is, based on the positive feedback of the first slice of the actors, the method is effective in achieving the objective of market access and mutual recognition when properly applied. And for a big majority of actors, the period of application was not long enough to enable them to learn by doing, because they do not apply so much. 2 to 3% of changes are significant. And the main problem is a lack, in fact, of understanding of the risk-based concepts and finding out what can go wrong, what is a risk related to change. Usually what is also observed is that the stakeholders do not notice that they already have in their safety management systems measures in place to control the risk. So they identify redundant measures. So for the moment, the survey shows that we have not collected objective justifications for motivating, requiring an urgent revision of the method. So the agency did not recommend to the Commission to revise the CSM. What we recommend is, just to see whether I skipped the slide, no, in collaboration with national authorities to put in place an appropriate dissemination program, as Pete was saying, teaching, educating, and training activities to increase the sector awareness on risk management concepts, which implies, remember, the link between risk assessment and monitoring. The effectiveness of one of the methods is dependent on the correct implementation of the other. and to leave the sector enough time to learn and improve by doing, so that we can then, in a couple of years, in a few years, make another survey with the NSAs, ECMs, certification bodies and assessment body, involving this time also the sector, to see indeed what is their effective, or their experience with the method. I try to change the slide. So I had the problem of, yes, okay, I did not skip slide. In order to avoid confusion and to unnecessarily create additional administrative complexity and misunderstanding of successive amendments of the legislation, while the railway sector is trying to implement the existing legal text, to learn and to improve by doing, and therefore they're trying to build a proper risk-based safety culture in a very complex environment, the agency recommends to build a solid return of experience with correct and clear justifications of why improvements or clarifications of the CSMs is necessary. Revision of laws must be motivated by objective reasons for actual weaknesses and problems with the CSM, instead, if I can say, of emotional and political beliefs. That will also permit to better target the needs for any additional dissemination and training activities. So the agency recommends also to take strategic reflections and decisions and initiatives with the Commission and the Member States concerning the education and training to compensate the current lack of experts in risk assessment on the market, to anticipate also the growing loss of railway expertise with a continually increasing number of employees of the railway companies reaching the age of retirement, and in the scope of implementation of the fourth railway package, to monitor how the NSAs supervise the use of risk assessment and monitoring in the SMS, to get the assurance that indeed the sector captures, assesses, properly controls and monitors the risks of both non-significant and significant changes, and to coordinate, to maybe make my colleague Ivan happy, to better coordinate with the European Cooperation for Accreditation, the accreditation bodies and recognition bodies, as well as the cooperation group of the assessment bodies, to better harmonize the requirements for the acknowledgement and the competence of the assessment bodies, and also to have something equivalent over the recognition bodies as what we have among the accreditation bodies. So the final slide from my presentation, what shall we keep in mind based on everything we have heard? I fully share with Pete what he said. The CSM legislation has not brought anything new that you were not already doing. So this risk assessment as a general tool is a means to an objective. It is not an objective in itself. The objective of risk assessment is not to make good and nice paper, but to keep people safe. The reluctance of the sector to using the CSM maybe do not look for a twisted and complicated interpretation of the requirements, but simply read and use common sense. Read what is written in the CSM. The CSM does not oblige you to forget your past ways of doing and the rules, but to know why you are using them. So what risks are you controlling? The methodology does not impose how to do things, but it is there to help the risk analyst reflecting and going through the right steps, asking him the right questions, and it does not replace the expert judgment and expertise of the risk analyst. He is the only one who is capable to take the decision. The tool cannot do that. The method leaves place to use Yellow Book or other guidance material. Do not forget that there are guidance materials available on the agency webpage. And what Pete said, the single application of whatever methodology, code of practice, explicit estimation, or risk assessment technique does not guarantee that the hazards are identified and actually controlled, the risks are controlled to the right level. So it is crucial that we use competent people with good knowledge of both the railway system and risk analysis techniques, so that we have successful risk assessments. So for additional guidance, don't blame the CSM that it doesn't contain it. It gives the minimum harmonized framework, and the guidance can be found in Yellow Book, Senelec standards, and the IEC 61508 as examples. So normally this finishes my presentation, Colin.
The start of your previous presentation, for some reason the microphone didn't connect properly, so hopefully we're back on and you can all hear me now. So thank you very much indeed to all three of our presenters. We now get to the question and answer session. If I can ask all three to turn on their videos and microphones, and we can start tackling the very big list of questions that have been arising. And I thank you all very much for putting your questions. Presenters, please, can you come back online with your videos and audio, and then we can crack on with the questions. Ivan, Dragan, are you still there? Hopefully. Looks like you're on your own, Pete.
Oh no. I have to answer all the questions on my own.
Looks like it.
I asked the audience.
I think so.
I'll just pass off my questions to Pete.
Anyway. Okay. Welcome back, guys. Thanks very much again for giving the presentations. We've got lots of questions to get through, and what I would say to start off, if we don't manage to get through all of these by the finish time of 22 to 2, we will attempt to answer the questions on written responses after the event. So hopefully we can get good answers back to you on all of these. I'm going to start off with a question which I think was oh, hang on, who did that? Which was started off being raised in Ivan's presentation. This is a question from John about CSM versus CDM, and in particular on large construction projects with small railway element, where the main players are not railway people. Large railway projects with small construction elements are easy. What do you all view on this? And it might just be worth, Ivan, there was a couple of questions about what actually CDM is for our non-UK audience. Perhaps you could just start off by just explaining that a bit.
But the CDM stands for Construction Design and Management, I think, if I remember well. It's a regulation that is focused on predominantly on managing health and safety during construction. It does have some impact on what happens after construction, but it's mainly focused on how we manage safety on site during construction. So to answer the question from John, in my experience, John, I would highly recommend not to do it. I cannot mandate that because it's not in my powers, but if I could, I would, to just really make it simple. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first one is that the way construction of CDM hazards are usually managed is different to the way the system safety hazards are managed quite often. So the construction of health and safety hazards are often managed by simply just going through this long list of low-level detailed items and ticking them off by applying some mitigations or going through making sure that it's covered by method statement or whatever. And for these, you don't need to produce any kind of safety case or safety justification. They are actually not supposed to be in the scope of independent assessment as though when they do their job, it's not in their remit. The project may decide to bring them in to do that, but it's not in their remit. And there is a slightly different set of skills required as well to manage them. And you don't often find people who do have both sets of skills and can manage both types of hazards. The other bit is I've just seen, and I'm not pulling the numbers from thin air, they are real life examples. So there's a program, I'm not going to say which one, but because they're now fixing it, there's a program that before stage grid 3, which is an early stage in network array life cycle, so it's when the option is chosen for how to proceed, already had more than 2,500 entries in a hazard record. So by the end of the program, you can easily add another 2 or 3 zeros to that number. So who is going to manage that? It's just something that is not manageable, and it hides what is important from what is really not important. So that's my view.
Okay, thanks. Dragan or Pete, would you like to comment on that?
I think that the answer given by Ivan is quite, I would say, reasonable, although it is not incompatible with the CSM, where the CSM project would just log that this is managed by following another code of practice for those families of hazards. And that can be done separately, and just a reference to the right tool or evidence for that. So I'm fine with what Ivan said, because this could lead to complexity in managing and losing the right thing to manage in each domain.
Okay, thank you. Pete, any NSA type view on that?
Not an NSA view, but one from a previous existence, where I found that myself in the situation of inheriting a project that had combined as record, where the CDM and the CSM managed together. It does provide, as long as you understand what you do, it does provide a level of complexity, as long as you designate which hazards are the CSM hazards and therefore need to be reviewed by the assessment body, and keep them out of the ones that are not necessarily part of the scope. Okay. You can do it. It's just I wouldn't try doing it on a large project, because as Ivan says, on a large project you could end up with something that's actually quite unmanageable, quite difficult. You don't want to end up seeing something. I think projects where I've seen it well, the ones where you use a proper database for managing hazards and hazard records, rather than and also requirements, rather than those that have tried to do it on an Excel spreadsheet. That was doomed to failure.
Okay, thank you. We've got a number of questions regarding. Sorry.
I'll just turn my camera off because I think my broadband is struggling.
Okay.
Outside, because I've seen it quite a few people think I'm breaking up. Well, definitely breaking up, so I just turn my camera off.
Okay. Well, yeah, there was 1 or 2 comments on that. So yeah, there's quite a few questions on significant change, which in terms of the experience of using the CSMRA and addressing the significant change criteria. So the question from Stephen here is, what is your definition of significant change? There are a number of criteria in the CSM, but for a routine, well understood change, you can get a non-significant change result, but still be safety related. Is this appropriate?
Hi again. Yes, as far as you do a risk assessment for identifying what can go wrong, and that you put in place risk control measures and that you document what you do, it's not incompatible. The only problem is not to conclude please for safety related changes which are non-significant equals permission to do nothing. And I think that Ivan in his presentation explained the figures. They make much more changes with risk assessment than 2 to 3% that I mentioned. So they manage also non-significant changes with the risk assessment, but they don't appoint an assessment body. So the only concern you shall keep in mind is that you must keep the change under control.
Okay. Pete, any thoughts on that, or Ivan?
Yeah, undoubtedly there is possibility at the way that the regulation specifies how you determine significance of the change. It's possible to have something that's safety related that does not trigger significance. And as Dragan says, you don't want to end up with the I'm not significant means I don't do anything. And that goes back to my comment about education and understanding what this actually means. You've still got to follow the process. Well, you've still got to follow a process. What you don't need to do is bring in an independent body to assess as an assessment body, and nothing wrong with that. But if you're putting something into use, you want to make sure that you are managing safety properly.
Okay, thank you. Ivan, any thoughts?
So indeed, under the framework, we are still rolling out in network failure system integration for delivery. The bit that talks about system safety, we clearly identify the scale of the effort required for significant and non-significant projects as well. So it really is just about the scale of the effort, not that you simply, if you're not significant, you do nothing. That's not at all the case. It's just for example, the engineering safety management plan for non-significant projects could be part of some other plan, just as a section. You don't require a separate engineering safety management plan. The expectation is that the hazard record will be predominantly closed through compliance with existing standards and good practice, as opposed to having to do any explicit risk assessment, etc., etc. So the whole thing should require less effort, but it definitely requires some work done.
Okay, thank you. And just on a similar theme, a question from Iona. How to define non-safe related changes? Technical modifications in existing rolling stock can be very small. A very simple example, add a sticker to a vehicle, adds a tiny bit more fire hazard. So this is then seems to be safety related, but most likely not safety significant. Would you agree with this conclusion, or should this example not even be classified as safety relevant in the first place?
An interesting one. I mean, I think, yeah, you need to assess every change for its safety implication, but the amount of risk, safety risk involved can vary very much between. Okay, if you're on the tipping point of something, you make a very small change on the wrong side of where you want to be. So yes, you need to understand that. I think. In taking this particular example, if I was to go back to what Ivan said about additionality, additionality can be a bit of a problem, not necessarily for rolling stock. If you're looking at the bigger picture, the small change, which does not seem in its own right to be having a big impact, can actually have a big impact if you understand its true context in terms of railway change. Minor change like applying a sticker to a railway. Okay, you do need to understand what you're doing. It's probably not going to trigger significant.
Oh, what's happened? Are we still there?
Yes.
What's happened to the video? Why is that?
It's hidden.
I've just lost the video on my screen for some reason. Okay,
it could be me. Sorry, I tried to actually just.
Have you just minimized it or something?
So I just closed it on my computer. I was not aware it's actually going to do it for everybody.
That's better.
This is strange. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Let's go back to the video then. Okay, so the yeah, the next question I was going to cover was one from Dominic. Where the term authorize is used, is this with respect to interoperability? Whilst they're both system safety processes, they're separate and should be kept so. This is what is confusing a lot of our project teams and making application and conformity a lot more difficult than it needs to be.
Okay, when we're talking authorized is under interoperability. So the requirement to have authorization to bring something into use, service. They are not separate. They are related processes. Technical compatibility as a safety element, and therefore technical and safety compliance needs to be demonstrated. You're not going to achieve an authorization unless you can demonstrate safe integration into the railway system.
Okay, Jugan, any thoughts on that one?
Before Pete thought, I was not sure to understand well what has to be kept in mind simply is that with the fourth railway package, the concept of authorization has been changed with respect to second and third package. Vehicles need an authorization to be placed on the market. No need for an authorization to use the vehicle, which doesn't mean that there is no risk assessment. And for fixed installations, there is no authorization for placing on the market individual subsystems and components, but there is a need to authorize the line with those components by the NSA. And what Pete says, it's correct, is that to give for the infrastructure, the example, the authorization, the NSA will base its decision based on reports coming from the applicant and from the notified body, possibly designated body and assessment body to give his authorization. So if it was related to that, I think this needs to be clarified indeed, the difference of authorization, which, and we don't speak yet here, Pete, about the authorization for the SMS, which is the equivalent of the certificate for the railway undertaking. So there is also such an authorization from the NSA.
I'll just comment that we have.
Pete, sorry, before you just can I just, we seem to be getting a few questions about the sound quality. Can you just we'll all turn our videos off and see if that improves the bandwidth? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, for clarification, the United Kingdom has not implemented.
Oh, I've lost it altogether now.
I also face difficulties in hearing Pete.
Yeah, Pete's lost it altogether. Let's.
I'm still here.
Okay, it's just coming in, fading in and out a bit, Pete. That's the problem.
Okay, maybe I'll try a different microphone.
Okay, let's move on to another question. This is one from Roger. Perhaps rather than answering the question, how do you manage organizational change? It's kind of, what has the experience been in considering organizational change as part of the overall CSM process? Because it was always going to be one of the more difficult areas to cover. Jugan, would you like to comment on that one?
Yes, it's a very good question, and for that I have to admit that there is an area for interpretation of the CSM. Usually organizational changes can be linked to the validity of the safety certificate of the operator. And in that case, we can expect that the National Safety Authority is involved in, or in future European Railway Agency, when there is a significant modification of the organization. Nevertheless, the CSM allows that for that, the applicant, when he makes the risk assessment, appoints an assessment body, and then it's quite difficult to give a single answer to that question. The survey simply shows that big companies, for example, DB or SNCF, when they make organizational changes, they have an in-house assessment body, in-house experts who can evaluate independently and give the assurance that everything is under control. But for the rest of the survey we have done in 2018, has not pointed out that there was a single organizational change or even operational subject to the CSM process.
Okay, thank you. Ivan, any thoughts on that one? Just about any network rail experience on using it for organizational change?
I have actually been involved in a couple of these, not necessarily running it, just was invited as a member of a panel. So we do hazard identification. We go through a process of looking at each of the hazards as consequences of the organizational change, and applying the CSM, but in a slightly simplified criteria. So, we actually look at additionality. For example, if there's organizational change running in parallel with another organizational change and so on. And as an example, when I was in London, Nottingham, we actually had 2 organizational changes of the same organization running in parallel by 2 different groups of people. So, this is the kind of stuff that we would look at in network rail. The CSM logic flow of questions to decide if something significant or not significant doesn't easily fit into organizational change, I have to say. So when we did it, we tried to kind of reason around it a little bit. But yes, we have followed that. We have the hazard record in place, and then it gets reviewed by a panel eventually for safe authorization of the organizational change.
Okay, thanks. Pete, any quick thoughts on that one?
I think CSM is an entirely appropriate way to manage organizational change.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time, and we've got loads of questions. As I said, we are coming to the end of the allotted time for the webinar, and we haven't hardly touched the surface with the questions, so apologies for that. As I said, we will try and provide written responses to these questions in the follow-up to the webinar. But I'll just perhaps finalise with this question from as the final question for each of the speakers to comment on. Is there any evidence that CSMRA has made the railways safer?
Maybe Dragan first, and then the others can complement.
Yep, sorry. Yep.
It was not the initial intention of the CSM for risk assessment to make the railway safer. If you remember the context of different practices in Europe, what we needed is a common tool so that we can mutually accept what is done in one country in another. So we needed a common instrument, because the safety culture of the railways was acknowledged in the directives. So has it improved? If it was badly managed before, we can expect that it should be now better with the mandatory involvement of the assessment body. So the question cannot be answered now, at least, but the overall objective with all the other work streams we are having should go to improving, because I saw a question related to humans in the railways, to the right processing of human and organizational interrelations with technical systems, to decrease the possibility of a combination of events which lead to an accident. And at the end, we will probably improve, because the complexity also of the architecture, as I said, improved. So this is my idea, my opinion about it.
Thank you. Pete?
I think I go following what Dragan says. No, I don't. It wasn't intended to make the railway safer. It was intended to provide a common minimum level of safety application across changes to the railway system and across the member states. Has it done that? Well, my own experience in the UK would indicate that I think there is a better understanding. There is a earlier application of system safety considerations. One would always hope that that creates a safer railway. I certainly think that the application of CSMRA has on occasions highlighted issues that otherwise would have slipped through the net. So yes, I think it's made things better. I don't think it's necessarily that we've got evidence that it's made the railway safer.
Okay, thank you. Final thoughts, Ivan, from an infrastructure manager's point of view?
Well, I would just agree with my colleagues that I don't think that was intention to make railways safer. And in UK, people may think I'm a biased. I'm really not. But we already did quite a lot of this stuff before. We just didn't call it CSM.
Sure.
In my mind, and I'm sure the same happened in other countries, in other places. I actually know for a fact it did. In my mind, as I said, there is some room for improvement, and it's really about clarification. So, you know, if people who are not experts in system safety or systems engineering, but are experienced chartered engineers, are struggling to understand how to apply it and are tripping over what should be relatively simple concepts, then clearly there is something we should all think about doing to make it clearer for them and to help them do it. Because in my mind, I don't believe we will ever have sufficient number of system safety experts to cover every single project we ever do in UK and railways with a system safety engineer. We must make sure that we enable people who are good in solid engineers to understand what needs to be done and do the work.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So I can bring the Q&A session to a close there, and thank our presenters again for their excellent presentations and going through the questions that we've been able to cover. As I say, we will try and provide responses to those questions in the follow-up email. So we've talked about
Colin,
yes.
Colin, may I would like that we finish the seminar with one warning in mind. Do not consider the independent assessment body as an enemy. Take it as a partner who is going to help you debugging your organizational issues and improving your processes, so that at the end you will not have difficulties to classify significant, non-significant, because you would have improved your knowledge and your processes. So thanks, Colin.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Sorry, then on that note, I agree with you 100%, but then for us was as well, please do not think that all project engineers and project managers are evil people who are there to just ignore everything.
It's got to be a mutual loving, I can see.
It needs to be both ways. It really does.
Yes, sure.
I agree with you both.
Right, super. Well, on those final thoughts, then we'll draw that to a close. So thanks again for going through that. We'll now just come to the end of the session. I'll just, if I could ask the three presenters to turn their microphones off, that would be great. I'll try and put the video back on to see if we still got. Hopefully, you can still see me okay. So normally speaking, the webinars that we record for our archive are accessible only to SARS members. Because this particular webinar has been so popular, and in fact we reached our attendee limit, and therefore some people have missed out on being able to see this. This is unprecedented; it never happened before, so it's obviously a very popular topic, and certainly is one that we then may consider to do further webinars on in the future. But to make sure everybody gets a copy, I'll be sending a copy of the link in the follow-up email later today, and so that you can all see that. Normally our webinar archive is accessible to members, and you can join as a full member of the society or a simplified associate of the society. Please see our website for details. Joining SARS is relatively easy. We have a range of memberships available for different skill sets within the safety and reliability profession. So SARS is a licensed member of the Engineering Council for professional registration at chartered and incorporated engineer level. And again, there's lots of details about the different types of membership and how to apply on our website at sars.org.uk. Finally, I'm now going to initiate a feedback form. Please can I ask you to fill it in before you exit the webinar. This information is really useful to us. I know we had a couple of technical issues during the webinar, but hopefully it didn't spoil your enjoyment of the event and getting useful information from it. The feedback form will only take a couple of minutes to fill in. If you requested a CPD certificate at the registration, that will be sent to you in due course. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank our three speakers, Dragan, Ivan and Pete, again for their commitment and efforts that they've gone into this this excellent presentation. Thank you all for staying on. We had 500 people attending, which is amazing. And as I say, it's clearly a very popular topic. And from me, I'd just like to say thank you again. And in these difficult times with the pandemic still going on, please all stay safe and hang on for the feedback form.